Welcome to Books on Point. The book Media in Post-Apartheid South Africa looks at media politics and the consumption of media as a way to understand recent political developments in South Africa. The author, Sean Jacobs, takes a probing look at television commercials and the representation of South Africans, reality television shows, and South African continental expansion, soap operas, and post-apartheid identity politics as a space for reassertions and reconfigurations of identity. Well, to talk to us about the media landscape in South Africa, particularly in post-apartheid South Africa, I'm joined in studio by Nicholas Hammond. Nicholas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Let's have a look at the state of the media industry in South Africa from your point of view. What does it look like for somebody who hasn't really played in it at all?
Well, I think, from the outside looking in, you'd probably get the sense that the media industry in this country is relatively diverse, and I do think that is the case. And I think from a journalistic perspective, we've got a lot of really good, strong media and fantastic journalists. Where I do take a bit of an exception to the current status quo of the industry is when I look at sort of more, I suppose, along the line of mainstream entertainment media, because I think that culture is upstream from politics. This is something we can't deny. It's always been the case. But I do often feel when I engage with a lot of the content that's out there, I feel that people who are not necessarily qualified to do so often venture into the realm of politics, and I feel that that can get a bit muddy and misguided, and often I feel that people say things they're not entirely qualified to, and I think that that kind of thing can spout pretty dangerous rhetoric a lot of the time.
One of the things that's notable about media developments in South Africa is that you look at soap operas that tend to be a reflection of what's going on in certain parts of society, and they give us an opportunity to be able to learn about a different culture or race that we may not necessarily have engaged with. But you also see the same thing with TV commercials, giving us an eye into what's going on. Like if you look at the Nando's ads, for instance, and various other brands. When you take in television commercials and the role that they play in being able to allow us as South Africans to, I suppose, do some self-introspection, look at us in a different way, what do you make of all of that?
So I think if you look overall at the landscape, the sort of directly political type commercial, I think is relatively small. It's sort of relatively close to the margins. I mean, brands like Nando's do it, and I think they do it exceptionally well. But I think for the most part, and having spoken to a few friends that are in advertising to kind of make sure that I'm right on this, I think for the most part, it's a case of just selling products and getting a sense of what does your audience really want to consume at the end of the day and how best to drive that message. Right. But when it comes to advertising, I think I would caution against it having a sort of like a moral function within society. I think it's more just a way of commenting that people would find interesting, and so is that they would buy products, if that makes sense.
Right. The one thing that's also happening in the media industry, and it's not just South Africa, it's globally, we're starting to see social media play a bigger role in the manner in which people consume their news. It moves away from traditional sources of news to something that's quick and instant, but it also has the risk of being fake and not true, because I suppose human biases and fear kick in and you just start retweeting and sharing that kind of information. What's your view on social media, especially when it comes to the political discourse, be it locally or globally?
Well, I think it's also worth saying that a lot of mainstream media has a very explicit agenda that they don't necessarily make the public all that aware of, and I think that social media, or the ability for people to create independently, has helped shift that zeitgeist a little bit, which I think is a good thing. On top of that, though, I mean, social media has pragmatically been able to do a lot of things to move political movements. If you look at something like the Arab Spring, the way that information was spread around those parts of the world was as a result of social media. In South Africa as well, things like the Fees Must Fall movement, a lot of protests were organized and information was disseminated by these kinds of platforms. But where I do think there's a bit of a misconception and misunderstanding is that I think political parties often maybe overemphasize the degree to which what they're saying on social media is actually impacting society. If you look at some of the parties in this country that tend to, say, trend the most or get the widest amount of traction, if you go to the polls, it tells a very different story.
Right. The one thing as well that's happening is we're living in a world now of disinformation, whether we like it or not. And someone once said we need to be able to tell the difference between disinformation and misinformation, because misinformation is an error. You don't deliberately mean to do it. But with disinformation, you can either, I suppose, sow fake news or play around with the truths, because context is everything. So if you don't have the context, I can play around with a bit of data. How do we as the media now approach this disinformation stage, and are we doing well enough to be able to fight that?
You're 100% correct. I mean, disinformation is far more pernicious and it has an agenda, and we know that in South Africa, I mean, things like Bell Pottinger have come out in the news and these have been quite well documented, but seemingly more and more there are instances of people who are either driving a political narrative or for the sake of trolling and disruption are putting news and information out there that just blatantly is not true. I think that there is some so there's a lot of groups like Media Monitoring Africa that are looking at different ways to address this problem. I think that they're doing very good work. But I do think that we have to rest on the laurels of traditional journalism and go back to the drawing board and do what we were taught to do. I mean, all of us, everyone that's in this room right now that's a part of the show would have gone to some sort of broadcast or journalistic school. And I believe that those original principles still hold very true. And I think that we need to make sure that we consistently reinforce them to fight against the scourge of disinformation.
On the same note is that in fighting this scourge of disinformation, paywalls. How do you feel about paywalls when it comes to accessing news? Because, you know, institutions like the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, they'll have paywalls in order for you to be able to access news. And the argument is, well, if you want good journalism, you have to pay for it. But the other argument, which I tend to worry about, and I wonder how you feel about it, is that you want to have credible news passing down to people who live in rural areas, who don't have the amount of money to spend $200 a month to be able to access credible news. How do we bridge that gap and allow them to be able to access that as well?
It's a great question. I think with a lot of paywalls, it is quite specific information. If you look to your Bloombergs or FactSets or companies like that, where the information is for something that the average consumer would not necessarily engage with. But what I have noticed has been a trend in media, and I think a very good trend, is there has been a huge retreat back to community-based news. So people wanting to hear things directly from their communities because they speak to them. If you look at the print market, for example, it's still incredibly alive within different communities in South Africa that can speak to the nuances and vicissitudes of very specific areas and how people understand things. But I agree with you completely. I think the risk of any member of society not having access to as much information as possible is an incredibly scary thing.
Right. And then I suppose there's also a role for community radio stations. They still play a role, even though people consume news via podcasts if you want a longer form of discussion. We're talking about the media industry, and some things work, some things don't work. From your understanding, what are we doing right so far as the media industry?
Well, in the media in South Africa, I mean, I think there is legitimate diversity. I think that there is there has been an increase in representation over the years, which I think is healthy as well. I think of, you know, we're in the SABC right now, a place that was the mouthpiece of the apartheid government, and I think a lot of people take for granted how specific and intentional that regime was in order to, you know, keep information in a certain way. And even this very building, you know, under the era of Cloudy and all of that, and I don't know if that's something people speak about or not, but I mean, I was working here at that time and it was crazy. But it seems to me now, and over the last couple of years anyhow, in terms of the work that I do and the things that we're interested in, that we're not silenced. I don't feel muzzled. I don't feel like I can't share diversity of opinion. And I don't feel either like I'm necessarily guided in one specific narrative or rhetoric or another. And so I think that that's ultimately probably quite a healthy space to be in.
Nick, thank you so much for your time. That's Nicholas Hammond talking to us about the media industry. Well, the self-help book for the week is titled Sweat, Scale, Sell, where Pavlo Phitidis draws on 25 years of direct experience in conceptualizing and building businesses across 4 continents, having started, built and sold 12 businesses, generating in excess of $300 million. He founded the Asset of Value method.